today's keynote luncheon, as you know, features Chairman Wheeler, and it begins promptly at 12:30. And unlike yesterday's luncheon, there will not be service during the speaker. So lunch service will stop when the chairman begins speaking. So please arrive to the luncheon session early or on time so that everybody can be seated and they can put out all the lunches immediately, and then the service folks will leave, the chairman will speak, and then we'll depart for our next concurrent session. So, and I'm supposed to just exaggerate the fact that there will be no exceptions. So get in there early or on time, and you will get your lunch, and we'll go from there. Also, a reminder to all the folks that are going to be touring the Monster Truck Session, Monster Truck Rally out, the production trucks, that the 3:45 to 4:15 refreshment break is kind of a unique one in that it will feature root beer floats and salty snacks. So you don't want to miss it. If you like root beer floats and salty snacks, please feel free to jump back inside the building here and into the exhibit area for that break, 3:45 to 4:15. All right, I think that wraps up the housekeeping items. Now on to protecting PEG for the next 15 years. And we have a great group of speakers today. We'd like to first begin by congratulating Mike Wassenaar, who was recently named the new president of the Alliance for Community Media. So congratulations, Mike. Mike currently is in Washington, D.C., and he represents and advocates for public educational and government access organizations and channels and the communities they serve. Prior to working with ACM, he was the executive director right here for the St. Paul Neighborhood Networks, SPNN, the nonprofit community media and technology center that provides public and educational access services for St. Paul, Minnesota. And under his leadership, the organization doubled in size in 10 years and diversified its revenue sources. Among other achievements, he helped create and lead the AmeriCorps Community Technology Empowerment Project, which provides digital literacy education to Twin City residents and is a model for digital literacy core articulated in the FCC's National Broadband Plan. And Mr. Wassenaar has a background in public and community radio as well, and was a reporter, news director, and program director for stations in Madison, Wisconsin, and Minneapolis and St. Paul before his tenure at SPNN. Welcome, Mike. Next to Mike, in the middle there, is Cor Wilson. Coralie has been the executive director for the North Suburban Communications Commission and CTV 15 in Roseville, Minnesota since 1991. Current responsibilities include cable franchise administration, management of the institutional network connecting 10 cities, 3 school districts, Ramsey County, and several private educational institutions, and management of the 10-city public access facility. She previously served as the executive director of the Miami Valley Cable Council in Kettering, Ohio, from 1983 to 1991, where she was responsible for cable franchise administration, the public educational and government access operations, and administration of the Tactical Crime Suppression Unit. Prior to that, she worked in the city manager's office in Dayton, Ohio, in public information and cable administration from 1977 to 1983. Throughout her career, she's been active in NTOA and the Alliance for Community Media, as well as their state and regional chapters, and she served as president of the NTOA Board of Directors from 2003 to 2005. Welcome, Cor. And last but not least is Brian T. Grogan, who is a shareholder and director of the Minneapolis law firm of Moss & Barnett, practicing in the firm's communications and business law and infrastructure practice groups. Since 1988, Brian has worked with entities throughout the country on a variety of cable, telecom, wireless, and broadband communications issues. In his business law practice, Brian focuses on fiber and conduit lease agreements, mergers and acquisitions, and contract matters in the communications and technology industries. Brian is the past chair of the Communications Law section of the Minnesota State Bar Association. Welcome, Brian. All righty. Well, we'd like to begin today. We're going to keep it just kind of loose and allow people to ask questions after the initial presentations. We want it to be a roundtable discussion. We're going to give each member of the panel about 5 to 7 minutes just to lay out some topics here. And then we've generated a few questions, but at that point, we'd just like to open it up and have a conversation across the board about strategies and ways that we can protect PEG for the next 15 years. So we're going to begin today with Brian and ask Brian he's got a brief PowerPoint here and talk about what the law says, legal strategies for our topic today.
We need this?
Yep.
Can you all hear me? Okay. I'm going to try a quick joke because it's a rainy day in my hometown of St. Paul, and I feel a little bad we don't have something better to offer, but I'm going to try to cheer you up. Now, I'm a terrible joke teller, so I will blow the punchline, but just bear with me on this. If you've heard this before, don't mention it to your friends here. All right, so there's a high school student, and that high school student has one last exam before they graduate, and it's a take-home exam, and it's just one question. What does 2 plus 2 equal? And the student's pretty sure they've got this one nailed. They're not even sure they're going to bother to take it home, but they were given an entire blue book to write this answer down. I'm dating myself. Well, at least when I took exams, we used blue books. So he figures, what the heck, I'm going to take it home. Of course, first thing he does, he asks his mom, Mom, 2 plus 2, and she confirms, yep, you got the right answer. So he asks Dad, gets the right answer. Figures, well, maybe I'll get a religious perspective. So he goes and he asks the family pastor, yep, I think you got this right, son, 2 plus 2. Figures, well, I better go check with the family accountant. I mean, it is a mathematical issue. The accountant confirms, yep, 2 plus 2, that's right. So he figures, well, I think I've got this wired, but I should probably just get a legal perspective just to make absolutely sure. So he decides he's going to go see the family attorney. And of course, the attorney is in the top floor of the tallest building in the city. And the student goes up there, and it's dark mahogany walls. Student sits down and tells the attorney the question, what does 2 plus 2 equal? And the attorney looks at him, stands up, shuts all the blinds in the office, closes the office door, sits down and stares back at the student and says, what do you want it to equal? All right, it works better with attorneys in the audience. Upstairs in the legal review, that would have killed, absolutely.
Sorry, I don't have the rim shot here.
Yeah, badoomsh. All right, so lawyers, we can make any law say almost anything we want, and sometimes we hear that from the cable industry. We might hear their interpretation of a particular law or a particular set of rules, and in some cases we might hear that PEG is on its last leg, that the laws have changed. There's this FCC order that was adopted a few years ago, and it's the nail in the coffin for PEG. Go ahead and find something new to do because it's going to be gone soon. And part of what I want to do in the first 5 or 10 minutes here this morning is just give you an outline of what the law actually says as we sit here today. And then we're going to use that as a foundation to discuss where PEG may be going in the next 5 to 10 years and things that we can do to protect it. Of course. There we go. All right. So the law. First of all, this law has really not changed in almost 30 years. We still go all the way back to 1984 when the Cable Act was first adopted. The primary rules in that law have largely stayed unchanged or have been untouched in that entire time period. So franchises that were adopted in the 80s and the 90s, we're looking at the exact same statutory language that we're all looking at today. And I know a lot of you are on the production side of this. You might be dealing with your executive directors or other elected officials. But if you're ever asked these questions, it's important to understand nothing's really changed all that much in the last 30 years. The LFAs, local franchising authorities, still have authority to mandate channel capacity for PEG programming. That is unchanged in 30-plus years. There's clear authority to provide not just the channels, but also the funding to support PEG. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time in the next few slides talking about this FCC order that is largely cited as the cure for everything under the sun if you're a cable operator. Just cite to the 621 order and it cures all evils as it relates to franchising authorities. That's not true. It's certainly not the most favorable order for cities, but certainly as it relates to PEG, it's not as damaging as some would lead you to believe. Let's see. Do I point it? I'm going to point it there. Abracadabra. There it is. All right, you got to say those words apparently. Authority to require PEG. And again, this is kind of rote information, but we're going to use it again as the foundation for what we're talking about later. What's key to take out of this is what I've underscored. Franchising authorities, which are cities, or in some of your cases, it may be the state that has this authority, have the authority to require channel capacity designated for the use for public, educational, and governmental use. I provided a citation there. That has not changed in 30 years. We still have the exact same authority that we had years ago, and that authority was, in some cases, used in cities to require as much as a third of the cable operator's entire available channel capacity to be dedicated for local programming. So nothing has been modified there, rather just in some ways a misunderstanding kind of propagated by rumors that are out there in the marketplace that somehow that we have fewer rights than we did years ago to mandate this capacity. With respect to the funding, it'd be nice if it didn't take me 30 seconds to change the slide. There we go. Franchise fees. We hear a lot about how we cannot exceed a 5% franchise fee cap. And I know there's a lot of folks that are new, and then there's some in here. I see Mike Reardon in here who could give this presentation if he wanted, because he's been doing this for so long. So some of this is repetition, but we have the authority, of course, to charge up to a 5% franchise fee. 5% of all gross revenues from cable services, not broadband services, not telephone services, not anything that's in between, just cable services. So we have this cap out there that the feds impose on us, and we can only go to 5%. The theory is that's supposed to be rental that the cable operator is paying in return for their ability to string wires down every alley, every sidewalk, across every park in town. They're renting that property to provide their service. No different than if Coca-Cola wanted to put a soda machine on the corner of a public street. There's a rental value to that property. But the franchise fee doesn't include certain things, and one of the key things it doesn't include is the final item on this slide. In the case of any franchise adopted after October 1st, 1984, long time ago, 30 years ago, capital costs, which are required by the franchise to be incurred by the cable operator for public, educational, and governmental access facilities. Basically, that's PEG support. That is over and above the 5% franchise fee. So there are operators out there, not all of them, but some of them, who would argue you're supposed to use your 5% franchise fee to support PEG. That's just flat out not what the law says. It's never been what the law says. This hasn't changed in 30 years. You have always, as a city, had the right to seek additional compensation to support PEG programming above that 5% cap. If you're one of the communities that is actually charging less than a 5% franchise fee, then this even becomes a more advantageous provision for you. It frees up some flexibility in how you can use this money. One thing to keep in mind from a political standpoint for cable commissioners, elected officials that might be looking at this, oops, there we go, subscriber itemization. Everything that you charge in a cable franchise can ultimately find its way back onto a subscriber's bill. And I provided a citation there. First thing that you can see, we all know we buy expanded, basic, maybe you're lucky enough to get HBO and watch True Detective. Very good show, by the way. If you pay for all those services, you then will see a line item that says franchise fee. So let's assume you have a $70 cable bill. You're going to see your line item, 5% franchise fee. That's item number one here. This is the provision of the law that lets the cable operator pass that through. There was a day that Cor and Mike and I remember when they used to bury that fee right into the actual price you were paying. You wouldn't see it broken out on the bill. Long ago, they decided they wanted to make local franchising authorities accountable for that fee, so they started breaking it out. They also have the authority to break out as a separate item on the bill the PEG fee. And they do that, again, for political accountability. In some cities, it might be zero. Some cities, it might be a percentage, 1%, 2%. Some cities, it might be a dollar amount. $1, $2, $4, pick your number. The number is used to drive and support the amount of money that funds these PEG facilities. So anytime you impose this, the operator always has a right to put it on the bill. And from a political standpoint, if you're the elected official, if you're the mayor, you may be concerned that having that show up on the bill, you may be hearing from your constituents. So there's always that pressure on the local politics. Try this one more time. There it is. All right, the first order on local franchising. This will put almost all of you to sleep, and I'm not going to read it all through. I provided this solely so you wouldn't have to look it up yourself. There is an order that was adopted back in 2007 that affected all of your lives. Because if everybody who's in here, your job depends on local production, local programming. You're doing one of the three things, P, E, or G, and you are probably providing valuable content for your community. This order really addressed what you do for a living and whether your franchising authority can obtain funding for that. What this first order said was, we have this 5% franchise fee, and you can't impose costs and expenses on a cable operator over and above that 5% franchise fee unless it falls into a specific exception. One of the exceptions, of course, is this PEG capital cost exception that we discussed. And again, without going into detail here, basically I tried to provide you line for line exactly what the FCC said, so you won't be confused if somebody tries to mischaracterize what this actually means. The problem with the first order was they said you can only use this money to build facilities. That works fine if you're building a brand new facility, but if you happen to be somebody that has a facility and what you need is brand new HD equipment, you might need $1 million worth of new equipment to make the transition from an analog world or an SD world up to an HD capable signal. That costs money. Does that fit within this exception that we're talking about? And the FCC left that question, unfortunately, somewhat vague in that first order. Not as vague as this clicker's leaving me, though. Second order. The FCC then decided, well, one order isn't enough. Why not do another one? So they adopted a second order. And what this one said is, they confirmed many of the things they did in the first order, but they ultimately helped us as cities. And they said, despite what we said in that first order, we really think that the definition of capital costs is expanded beyond just building facilities. It includes equipment, cameras, decks, lights, any kind of an asset that's used in the production or is used as part of PEG access facilities. Again, meaningful, I think, to most in the room because that's the equipment that we use to handle our jobs. And without that kind of funding, a lot of these operations dry up. So maybe unlike what you've heard from other folks, these orders don't present a nail in the coffin to say that you can't get funding for PEG anymore or that you can't get capacity. What they really do is confirm what the law has always said. You can absolutely mandate capacity for PEG channels, and you absolutely have the right to go get funding for PEG. Now, it leaves open this question about what can you do on operational expenses. Can we get money to pay for your salaries if you're a production employee? I'm not going to speak to that question. There's enough ambiguity in these orders that they really are that question remains to be decided. But what is crystal clear is any kind of capital asset, we absolutely have the right to pursue. It was hammered home a final time because we can't just rely on an FCC to do this. Lawyers need to make a living too, so it has to be appealed to a court because we need a judge to confirm exactly what the FCC did. So we had a Sixth Circuit decision where we went all the way up, and ultimately this went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically said, yeah, Sixth Circuit, you got this right, we're not even going to review it. So the Sixth Circuit decision is the binding law in the country on this issue. And I want to note your attention, for those of you that don't have this, this will be in the NATOA materials that you can get online. It's one of those things you put in the drawer and you have in case somebody ever asks you what the FCC order means. So save you a lot of time having to research it. Otherwise, you can use it for kindling for a cold night. But there's a provision in here that says, the last paragraph, thus, the unambiguous expression of Congress confirms that PEG access capacity extends not only to facilities, but to related equipment as well, considering both this clear congressional statement coupled with the fact that the agency, that being the FCC, concedes that its definition of capital costs covers the expense of equipment as long as it's incurred in or associated with the construction of PEG facilities. That's pretty clear authority that capital costs include everything under the sun as it relates to production of PEG programming. And that's really what my main message I wanted to deliver today was, despite everything that you've heard, from 1984 to today, you have absolutely crystal clear authority to provide or to mandate capacity for PEG channels. And we'll get into the issue of can you mandate that for HD, for SD, can you mandate the compression technology, and I think there's answers to those questions. But the second point I wanted to emphasize is you absolutely have authority to seek funding to continue your PEG operations. I think that's a key issue, and it's one where there is a lot of confusion out there. If these orders don't tell you enough, come and see me, because there's a lot of backup to these, a lot of briefs and other things that you can use, and you can have your attorneys or your negotiators armed with this when they sit down with the cable operator, and they may be hearing a different story. Because what you do in your franchise renewals or in your negotiations on this really do drive to the likelihood of a long-term viability for your production facility. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff.
One, two, there we go. All right, thank you, Brian. Our next topic is going to be handled by Michael. Today to tomorrow, potential threats and opportunities.
Thanks, Jeff. Can everybody hear me? All right. And thank you for the opportunity to talk to everybody here. And I'm going to resist the opportunity to continue with the Minnesota jokes. Although, if you want to hear a really good Ole and Lena joke, I'm happy to talk to you after the discussion. I learned long ago it's best not to go blue this early in the morning in a public presentation. So find Minnesota tradition of Ole and Lena jokes I can introduce you to a little bit later on. I guess the things I want to impart and talk about, just to kind of tee up the discussion here for the rest of the session, very, very briefly, is to give you two frameworks by which I tend to think about the issues that PEG facilities are facing, and then talk about sort of threats and opportunities in a general sense rather than the specific fights that are happening maybe at the franchise level with LFAs across the country. And we can get into those specifics as we're having I hope, a very good discussion with you all here today. The first sort of general philosophy I want people to be thinking about, and this is something I think a little bit with my work with ACM, is that we want to be fighting for everything that we have today, and we need to be building for what we want to be serving tomorrow. It can't just be about sort of preserving the past. We need to be hanging on to every asset we have to be able to deliver services to our communities well. And then we have to be thinking about the emerging technologies, emerging opportunities, and we need to be ready for those to be able to meet those, because if we don't, I think in many respects, our operations lose a sense of legitimacy amongst the very constituents that they have to be serving, not just the community at large, but also the elected officials who drive a lot of the decision-making within the local franchise authority. The second thing I'd ask people to think about is to really concentrate a little bit about the way people are using media, and specifically look at the way media fails people, because that can give you an insight into what market opportunities exist as you're delivering services and building services, but it also really helps to define your value proposition for communities that you're supposed to be serving. And I think if you talk to most Americans around the country who are not on the Eastern Seaboard or not in LA and San Francisco, and in this sort of metaphorical or real flyover country, I think most people will say to you that media fails them by and large, because it treats them as flyover country. And the distinct value proposition that PEG provides is the promise that really exists today, that was in the law back in 1984, of localism and local responsiveness of media systems to be able to meet information needs that people have legitimately. So I can't stress enough how you have to be using local in your terminology, and you have to be thinking about the way in which you fit within a media ecosystem, and you are unique and valuable. Because if you believe you are worthless, by goodness, you will be worthless. I'm thoroughly convinced of that. And part of the game that happens in negotiations very often with the cable industry is say things like, oh, nobody watches you, you're outmoded technologies, you're outmoded thinking, it's a way of the past, we need to be thinking about the future. To which I would say, no, you actually need to be looking at the media landscape and the needs that people have today, and that we really do fit an incredibly important role in our democracy, but also in the way people use media. And we can talk about that in some more detail. So here are some threats that I see and some opportunities I see, just on a broad basis, that I just want to kind of outline very, very briefly and then hand things over to Jeff and Cor. One is that the sources of funds to create local programming and content generally are diminishing, not within just the PEG ecosystem, but also generally throughout the media ecosystem. And actually, as you look at the discussion of the AT&T DirecTV merger, as well as the Comcast, Time Warner, Charter, SpinCo, now Media Cable, now Great Land Communication Love Fest. Sorry, as an editorialization there. Sorry about that. The purported benefits of these transactions are that these massive corporations become more massive to get more economies of scale to be able to provide content from other places. So more stuff that you don't need from someplace else is a way in which you can really, I think, characterize the purported benefits of these transactions. But I think it sort of puts sort of some context to the work that we do. And I know certainly within the context of working within local government, the last 5 to 10 years have been challenging in terms of getting resources to be able to create programming. I think those continued pressures will be determining the ways in which PEG does or does not grow at the local level across the country, just as much as the pressure of the cable industry has on negotiations. Because local franchising authorities have to have the ability to be able to see the value, but then also have to meet other needs. So I think there'll be continuing pressure specifically on those fungible resources with the franchise fee structure that we have right now. And that, I think, is driving a lot of the discussion that's happening in various states about the definition of the PEG fee specifically. And we can talk more specifically about that. But the reference that Jeff made in terms of the definition of PEG fees specifically does affect many communities that still have PEG fees available to them, who have not been affected by pernicious state laws that have eliminated the ability for localities to give PEG fees. So that's why you're seeing California asking for flexibility to be able to actually have PEG fees supporting operating costs. And I think you're going to see a continuing movement to be able to free up money to be able to actually give more resources to create local programs. But I think that's a continuing threat, not just for PEG, but generally in the media ecosystem. I think also you've got decreasing opportunities to be able to see things that are local. One of the things I think that will be a challenge for us all is to think about how we deliver programming in a broadband plus over-the-top video market. And if you don't have an ability to be able to have findable, understandable local programming on that interface, you don't exist. We currently see that in terms of the fights that go on around electronic program guide or video program guide across the nation. And I would say to you all, if you do not think that search is a key function of being able to find a program, you obviously don't own a television set in America. So, if there's a sort of subsidiary recommendation I could have for everybody is make sure you have a TV and you use it so you understand how people actually use television. Having a DVR is actually, and DVR functionality is actually the way most people in America use television. And if you do not have the ability to actually see a program on a DVR, you do not exist. We haven't talked about it in that fashion. But once you think about that, it drives the decision-making you have in terms of the things you're fighting for. And it also underscores exactly why search and electronic program guide are not just sort of bells and whistles, but they're vital functions for how people use program content. Okay? I think another thing I would just say to you all, and just in terms of a threat that we have, is the growth and retention of talent in our industry. I don't want to make any characterizations of how you guys are feeling today on the second day of the conference. At 51, I'm feeling a little creaky. I know if I was 35, I'd be a little bit more energetic. But I think, if you're going beyond that sort of gross characterization of the aging of our industry, we need to be able to grow and retain young talent to be able to begin new program efforts, drive initiatives that will actually build our industry, and replace us when we retire, because by God, I hope we all retire someday. Okay? Maybe I shouldn't count on it because of the nature of Social Security in America, but the growth and retention of talent in competitive markets, and I would say also specifically in local markets that are being served by PEG and very often can't find talent because you're in a semi-rural market of 50 or 60,000 people, and the economy doesn't sustain local creative economy jobs is a huge issue if we think about trying to preserve localism at the local level, not just in urban markets around the country, but in smaller markets as well. Because you need people to be able to create programming. It's not just about gear and the enabling laws. You actually need to have the creative talent to be able to be meaningful. And then I'd say that the last thing is a challenge for us is our abilities to innovate, create, build, and learn, which I would say has not necessarily been a strength in our industry. And that kind of gets us behind the 8 ball in many initiatives. That's a muscle that we can all grow. But it means that you actually have to be concentrating on trying to do that. And it may not necessarily be, for example, the function of a certain department within a government agency to grow and innovate. But somehow we have to be thinking about that in terms of our charges as PEG professionals, in terms of the services that we're trying to build, because that's the way we get ahead of the game, it seems to me. So that's more of a sort of another threat, and it's not an opportunity, it's a threat. Here's 4 quick opportunities to be thinking about, and then I'll hand things for 5 quick opportunities. You're going to be hearing more and more about both the customization of services. We already see that in terms of the way in which the electronic digital economy works, where everything is customized to you. And as well, you're going to be hearing more and more about getting to scale. We need to be getting services up to scale on a national or a trans-global level. So the model for local services, I think, is still a unique proposition that you need to find a way to articulate and capitalize on. If you can be meeting the needs of your local community, you will have an advantage over your competitors. So you need to be thinking about that just on a continuous basis. A couple of things to just kind of put out for you. There's really been a sort of a death of news in America and sort of a rebirth of new conceptions of news and news consumption that are happening. Very often that reconception is of smaller, more sort of micro enterprises that are happening for local news operations that are being operated by nonprofits. I think that's a huge growth opportunity, specifically, that PEG operations should be thinking about. Lifelong learning and community-based education will only grow in its importance in America in the next 30 to 40 years. Our centers can be strategically set to advantage in an environment in which you need not just discover 1 new career, not 3 new careers, but maybe need to be thinking about building skills on a lifelong level. And I think it's fair to say that our educational systems are not great at that. But as community-based educators, we actually have a strategic advantage that we should be thinking about. I think there's a lot to be said for the vital role that we have as civic agents, building civic connections and civic engagement. And that can be both for the nonprofit as well as for the government agencies that are doing work to be able to inform citizens about how government works. And I would say we are probably in store for a crisis in how government works, not just at the federal level. We're seeing that now, because the federal government really doesn't work. At least Congress doesn't work. But I would say that crisis will be infecting local governments, I would say, if it hasn't done so already in your local area. There's a challenge that you have to be thinking about ensuring that citizens actually have the information they need to be able to have government work well. I think many of us have the naive notion that government is a good and that it should be responsive to its citizens. And citizens need to be informed to be able to make good decisions so that government can serve them well. That's sort of the the logic model that many of us have had for many, many years as we've been doing our work. That logic model, I think, is being challenged by people who say that government shouldn't exist at all. So I think that there's an opportunity to be engaging with people to talk about why civic engagement is positive. And we shouldn't be fearful of that discussion. And then I would say the last opportunity to be thinking about is thinking about different corporate forms and social ventures that are being presented, not just in the United States, but around the world. As people are thinking about social entrepreneurship, trying to give people opportunity to build economic tools so they can better their conditions, I think we've been pretty good in terms of trying to find flexible structures to meet community needs. So that's the reason why you see nonprofits working in partnership with local franchising authorities across the country to be able to provide services and actually gain resources that maybe a local government couldn't do because it's not a public charity. That's actually a good form of corporate structure to be able to be responsive to ongoing community needs. We don't often think about it that way, but actually it's a good way to be able to have like an innovation partner that works with a community governance partner. But I think there's other sort of forms that we should be thinking about as we're moving forward, because I think the delivery of government will be changing in the next 30 years, as well the delivery of social systems and the definition of social good will be changing. So we need to be able to be flexible and thoughtful and innovative to be able to be ahead of that change. So those are just kind of things I want to put out there, sort of thought bubbles. I didn't want to focus too much on the Ole and Lena joke. Again, it's a really good joke, but I'll talk to you after the break. All right, so let me turn it over to Jeff and Cora.
All right, thanks, Mike. On last, for our roundtable discussion points, core 5 to 10 year vision for PEG to remain viable. What can your community do?
Boy, if I had the answer to that question, I'd make $1 million.
That's right.
Just a little background about our organization, formerly known as the North Suburban Access Corporation, but we informally call it CTV North Suburbs. We're a 10-city consortium just north on the other side of the boundary from St. Paul. And originally, in our franchise, the cable company, and in many of the franchises in this metro area, the cable company was responsible for doing public access, which was a different model than had been promulgated in other parts of the country. When PEG was first envisioned, they were separate legs of a stool. Public access for individuals in the community, educational access for the schools, government access for the local governments. And frequently they were set up as separate organizations. So the city did the government access, a nonprofit did the public access, and hopefully the schools would do something. Since the schools typically didn't get any funding, frequently they didn't do anything. So that was fairly not uncommon. So we, again, the cable company was responsible for PEG, did it poorly, and our commission was very frustrated and was one of the first in this area to make the transition, to go to the cable company and say, we don't like this is not working, and a new owner said, we agree, we shouldn't be doing public access, you should be doing public access. And so we set up CTV North Suburbs to do that, and I was hired in 1991 to come in and get that organization up and running, which I admit dates me a little bit. And part of the reason they hired me is that I had been doing almost the same thing in Ohio at the Miami Valley Cable Council, where we also had a multi-jurisdictional consortium, and we did everything. We did government, public, and educational access. And so I did the same thing here. I thought, it doesn't make sense to separate those. There are economies that can be had, both in terms of purchasing equipment and sharing staff, to work all together. And so we've really, from the beginning with our organization, started working on what is now known as the community media center model. So we didn't just do public access, and I think the traditional idea of public access is the individual producer who comes in and produces a program on his or her own, using his or her own sort of resources, if you will. They get their own crew. We just provide the training and the equipment. And instead, we went out and we would, on our own, find the volunteers and cover parades and city festivals, graduations for the schools. We worked with the schools to do sports programming. They use our equipment. They don't generally have their own equipment. They use our mobile production trucks. If there was a hearing, if Congressman Vento was having a hearing on the Twin Cities Army ammunition plant property and what to do about that, we would show up and cover that. So we do a variety of programs, and they are initiated, and we work with the cities. The cities, in our case, keep the bulk of their franchise fees, and for the most part, they televise their council meetings and some of their other meetings. But most of them didn't do much production. There was only one city, and their municipal producer is here. There was only one city, the city of Mounds View, that actually did anything beyond council meetings at that point. And so we would help them with our staffing and interns and volunteers to do their production beyond council meetings. Again, it was very efficient. It was cost-effective. We work with, it also gave us Mike talked about community resources. It gave us the opportunity to work with nonprofits in the area, and they become collaborators in terms of finding resources and working together and producing programs. I think one of there's several things that are important about considering the future of PEG. Or community media. One is, as Mike has pointed out, the need for communications is still there. The distribution may change. It may or may not be on a traditional cable system as we see it today. How many of you are doing any kind of web streaming? Most of you. So if you're not web streaming, you need to be web streaming. Unfortunately, there's no funding model necessarily for web streaming, but at least not yet. But at any rate, I see community media is only marginally about the distribution. It's really about the communication. And so you need the capacity, whether it's equipment or bodies or both, to produce programming. One of the things that people say to me as well, with YouTube, you don't need PEG access facilities anymore. Well, there's a limit to what you can do in terms of your telephone, your smartphone. I defy any of you to go out and cover a high school football game with your smartphone. It can probably be done, but it's not going to be nearly as watchable as if you send out a production truck with 3 to 5 cameras, and these days in high definition. So, or a parade, or a concert. So there's limits to that sort of low-end technology, and that's not to say that doesn't have value. It does. But for those people who want to go beyond that, our community media centers are generally where you're going to find that kind of equipment. And then viewers. I mean, we're not doing this just because it's fun, although it is fun, but we honestly want to have viewers. So we need to make sure that we're communicating and people can find us. And whether you're doing web streaming or whether you're doing it on the cable system, they need to be able to know where your programming is. Collaboration, and then funding. One of the things that we are looking very hard at is how do we structure ourselves for the future, for less funding in the future, and there will be less funding in the future, and how do we look at other funding sources? In our area, one of the things that we've done for a number of years now is production services. I learned early on that for nonprofits, it's very difficult for them to take a class, get the expertise that they want in order to produce the kind of quality program that they want. It's much easier for them to get a grant that includes a communication component and then pay us to do the production for them. But we're a community media center. I was at an affinity dinner on Monday night, and some folks from Houston were there. Are they in the room? We have a couple. One of the things that they talked about, the session or the dinner was really to talk about customer service, which most of us thought was customer service with the cable customer. But for them, it was customer service both with their internal, they were producers, with their internal departments, as well as one of the things that they've started doing in Houston is they've started a production arm for outside production. So companies and organizations in Houston can hire their production arm in the city to produce programs for them that may or may not end up on the channel. Just as our programs may or may not end up on our channel. So I think one of the things that the first thing I would encourage you to do is, even if you're not in franchise renewal, think about doing a needs ascertainment-like process. It gives you really good information about what your community is looking for, what your community needs, and that's going to be very different if you're in a larger city versus a suburban area versus a small town. But getting that information is really critical. It also helps build awareness of what it is you do and helps build some of that collaborative process that, oh, you know, I didn't know you guys could do that, but, you know, we've got this project going on, and could we work together on it? So it gives you that ability to communicate with your community and create a dialogue. I don't know where we're going to end up in 10 years or 15 years, but again, I will say, I don't think the need for local community communication goes away. We just need to be very creative in how we approach both the structure and the funding aspect to make sure it continues to happen. And with that, I'll stop.
Great. Thank you, Cor. All right, at this time, we'd like to open it up for questions. We've generated a couple, but if there's anybody that has, hey, Mike, okay.
Mike Reardon, City of St. Paul. This has been very helpful, and I was kind of expecting what you guys said, but I was waiting for you to talk more about digital inclusion or becoming more of that aspect for the community, because I think that's a huge opportunity for a lot of the facilities to really start taking that on for their community.
I appreciate you saying that, Mike. I would put the entire process of digital inclusion in terms of the framework of the responsibility of government to be able to civically engage with all of its citizens. So I think often we don't talk about it in that respect. Very often we talk about it in terms of market failure, where not everybody has the opportunity to buy more stuff. Right, and actually the BTOP was sort of predicated on that idea, is that, you know, we need to be generating market demand, and therefore we have more people on computers so that they can get onto Amazon and be more digitally engaged in that respect. But certainly from a government framework, it's important that if more and more of your services are being delivered on a digital platform, everybody needs to be on board. You cannot have, to my mind, you cannot have an inequitable situation being promulgated in a community And very often this is on a statewide level because states now have almost all of their systems in electronic means as a way to be able to cut costs. You cannot promulgate a system by which a third of your citizens can't participate and be called a responsible democracy. So I think there's a call to action for local government, particularly, to be involved in this kind of work, specifically to ensure that they actually get good information as well. Because, for example, if you're testing or polling communities and you're only getting 2/3 of your population, you actually don't understand the population needs within your citizenry. And I think increasingly that's going to become if we don't look at digital inclusion specifically in that framework, we're setting ourselves up for failure of delivery of services for the people who can benefit the most, but then also bring back the most economic gain in some respects. We actually see this in the Twin Cities. And that's one of the reasons why we did digital inclusion in Minneapolis and St. Paul for many, many years, was to make sure that everybody was on board and everyone was in the boat.
Just a couple of things. One, and I'll credit Mike for this. SPNN is a contractor for the CTEP program in the Twin Cities area. And they do a couple of things. One is literally computer literacy programs and training at libraries and other facilities. But they also facilitate the youth media program. And we work with SPNN, and we've got a youth media employee through CTEP now at our facility. And it's transformed our facility. It's brought young people in outside of the schools, if you will, and there's a lot of concentration on not just the production aspects, but the media literacy aspects of media education and leadership development. And then the other thing that we've started working with a couple of years ago is one of our community centers provides GED education specifically for non-English speaking students. Despite its reputation, the Twin Cities Metro has become very, very diverse. We have the largest Somali population, one of the second largest Vietnamese, Southeast Asian populations in the United States. We have a very large Karen population. There's just much more diversity, even Russian speakers. It's just very interesting sometimes. And so there's this program at the community center that helps these students get their GED. And what we've done with the community center is introduced a media education component. And they come to our facility, they learn how to use the equipment, and it's part of using the language. It's part of their understanding. They come from many countries where they don't have the opportunity to speak and don't have the First Amendment. Well, here you do, and here's how you can exercise that. So there's a whole lot of things that these students learn in that aspect. So I would heartily encourage you to look at that as a part of your function.
All right.
Hi, John McHugh, City of St. Louis Park, Minnesota. I wonder if Jeff, Cora, and Mike can speak to inclusion for people that want to use their device to produce rather than the traditional camcorder and the traditional PEG equipment that we may still have. Is there any successful models out there?
Well, we've said for a long time, we changed our policies a number of years ago because we recognized that people had their own equipment. If they live in our 10 cities, we consider them a resident. We don't care whether they produce it on our equipment or their equipment. Their program goes on our public access channel, our community access channel. We actually do have a channel for non-local programming, but if they've produced it and they're a resident, I don't care what they've used to produce it on. It's a local program, and it's a residence program. I think we have to start loosening some of our definitions and looking at, again, not being concerned about whose equipment, but where they live.
And I'd even go a step farther philosophically to say that, you know, what our practice was at SPNN is we were about building a production community and a community of practice. So we were very interested in making sure that we were working with documentary filmmakers, other media makers within the Twin Cities, not just St. Paul. We weren't necessarily just residency-based, although we had incentives for residents specifically to be served by our organization. So it's really important for us to be able to have, you know, that conduit for, you know, other nonprofits to get their programming to us, and then back outward, we would often train organizations so that they're producing not just for our channel, but they'd actually be producing for Twin Cities Public Broadcasting, because they wanted to reach a broader audience just beyond St. Paul, and they knew that the broadcast footprint actually went to the entire DMA. But and then a couple other quick notes here. There are a number of organizations that will either do training on portable devices for sort of quick production, and then actually there's someone here in at NATOA that specifically has looked at youth media news production on the Apple device. Jay April from Akaku in Maui is here, and he's trying to teach. He comes from a news production background, so he's trying to teach young people how to do short local news spots, 3 minutes or less, with in-camera editing, and then find ways to distribute that back up, not just on the channel that they operate, but also in a web platform. And that's like one example. There's actually a number of examples that are like that, where you're trying to use more flexible equipment. You're probably investing more in education than you are in equipment. And I think that's the other reason we need to be thinking about, you know, supporting training, education, curation, news production, rather than just gear. Because I think there's a lot more opportunities there.
You said Maui, right?
Maui.
Who's in for a road trip?
You can do a site visit. It's very
Yeah.
nice place.
Just one on the other side that and because this has come up in some discussions with some of my commissioners, our equipment is paid for by cable subscribers in our 10 cities. And one of my commissioners was a little surprised that we allowed people from outside our 10 cities to come in and use our equipment, and at this point to use it for free. Now that will likely change in the future, but there is a policy issue between residents and non-residents, and balancing the inclusiveness and the reality that for most people, jurisdictional boundaries are very fluid. I've known people who did not know they lived in a particular city. They thought they lived in St. Paul, and they actually lived in Roseville or Shoreview or wherever. So, you know, for a lot of people, those jurisdictional boundaries are not as fixed as for elected officials, if you will. But that having been said, it's, you know, so there's a balancing act that you have to play sometimes. And, you know, just because something, there are many programs that are produced that have equal value in terms of their information value around the metro, because the issues are the same. So you, again, it's just be prepared for that kind of pushback from sometimes elected officials who say, why are we letting these people who don't even live here use this equipment?
And I would say you're trying to build constituency. So it's very common for people to work in one county, live in another county, send their kids to another school district. That's kind of like life in the metropolitan area. It may be a very, very different type of discussion in a smaller community that's more isolated. That's another thing to be thinking about. And then I would say just, you know, the reason why there's all that confusion, Cora, is St. Paul is a state of mind.
All right, next question.
All right, on that note, while I'm generally inclusive, I can see pushback for people saying, well, cable subscribers versus non-subscribers, they're paying the fee, et cetera. I'm curious about, Coralie, your organizational structure, whether you're a JPA or something. That's important for me to understand a little bit as we're in a bit of an inflection point in our history. But I've always seen our what we've done as a platform And now it seems like evolving into a service agency is really where we need to move. But still, there's the ecosystem, the communicators ecosystem in our community that we want to foster. But can that be a bit of an economic stimulus for cottage industry producers, people come in, use the platform?
I think so. It's what we have found over the years. Initially in 1991, we were the only ones who had the equipment. We were the only ones who had cameras and editing equipment and stuff. And now, of course, I remember the days when an edit system took up an entire 10 by 10 room, and now it's all on one computer. So, people have bought their own computers, and they've bought their own cameras, and they do their own production. And we use some of those folks. We hire some of those folks to do contract production or contract training or whatever. So it does, there's a real synergy that develops around the production community, if you will. So the other thing that I would like to point out is that community media centers are sometimes even more about they're more than just about production. They're also about community, and a lot of people come in and volunteer because of the social aspects and because they feel like they're giving something back to the community. No different than folks who use libraries or community centers. So we're becoming a little bit more like those organizations, if you will. And then we foster lots of stuff that goes beyond that.
So I'd say yes on the economic development. Let me give you two examples. One is at SPNN, because of the work we were doing to be able to build documentary producer skills, we actually saw a host of small business spinoffs from independent producers who are making a living. Specifically, I'd say probably over the course of the decade I was there, it was about 20 people who became small business owners, doing independent production work of various types, whether it be web production or alternatively documentary film, commercial spot production. The second would be the effect that we've had, I think, as an organization, historically with other organizations in our community. We're very proud of the fact that people would graduate from our programs and get jobs at other centers. So as a job creator there, we would actually be helping to define new opportunities with organizations like CORES, who weren't funding youth media programs prior to their sort of kickstarting when we placed an AmeriCorps member with them, 6 years ago now. And graduates of the program get jobs in libraries, at other community media centers, and actually become evangelists for our cause, which I would really kind of have people think about. And then the third thing, get back to Mike's question about digital literacy, is that the reason why we got involved in being involved with digital literacy in libraries and economic development centers was because we knew that there was an underclass in our community that didn't have the ability to see our programs on any platform. And then as a side benefit, we served probably about 4,500 people a year through our educational programs in digital literacy, of which a third got jobs each year through our programs. Right? So you can point specifically to the lifting of the community through that kind of educational work. So I'm a firm believer in it. And then if people are concerned about this not drifting from the mission of say for example, a freedom of speech platform, because we were a public access organization as well as an educational access organization, I would often point to FDR's For Freedom speech. To talk about our freedoms not necessarily being dependent just upon the First Amendment, but upon the other freedoms that we build in our community. And economic freedom is one of those keys. So I can't say enough that that's an opportunity to be thinking about.
What, if I can, just for a second, Cor mentioned the word community, and I think that's key in all levels of PEG. But in the way the city of Tacoma handles, we're government access. But when a community member identifies, let's say, Boys and Girls Club scholarship event, and it's an evening event, and all of a sudden now you're going to have to pay, staff either overtime or hire freelancers to come in and help with your truck roll. We seek out a sponsor in the community to cover those costs, and those costs sometimes are in the neighborhood of $3,000. And banks or the entity itself, Boys and Girls Club, we do Relay for Life, we do the Pierce County Economic Forecast. They do an event where they identify where we've come over the last year and where we're going for the next year, potentially. So don't be afraid to, step out of the box a little bit. And, we're so used to saying, this is our budget and we got to stay right here. And before I went to Tacoma, I was not used to that either. So it kind of opened my eyes and to hear what Houston's doing last night or the other night at our affinity dinner, I mean, that was even another step. And, I'm not sure we're ready to go there because we've got enough work to do at our own place. But again, if it means to, generate revenue to keep livelihood and keep staff, then, maybe it's something to explore. So, yes, sir.
Oh, perfect segue into my question. Historically, our PEG has had a pretty fine line in the sand as far as businesses. So if it's a nonprofit business, we do business with you. If you're a for-profit, we sort of stay away.
Oh.
But we're at the point now where we're saying, well, they're important parts of the community as well. I mean, if you wanted to do a financial abuse seminar, for example, on air, what better producer than to be a bank, for example? So I'm curious to see how you folks address the issue of commercialism.
Finally, a question for the lawyer in the group. I felt like a fish out of water up here. All these creative ideas. I only understand contracts. The issue of commercial programming on PEG is really it comes down to content-based decisions. I mean, everyone's talking about community in comparison to libraries, parks. Think of yourself as a public park. If you're doing public access, you are no different than a public park. Anyone gets to speak in the public park. Anyone gets to have a parade in the park, right? That's the beauty of it. Whether we like your message or not, you could be screaming the most offensive thing at the top of your lungs. You get to march in the park. Similarly, on the public access channel, anyone is allowed to air programming on there. You can make very limited, what we call time, place, manner restrictions. If you have, controversial topic, maybe an adult-themed topic, you can put it in a safe harbor after 10 or 11 o'clock at night. But to the issue of commercial programming, same issue. Just because I happen to work for a for-profit entity does not mean I'm not entitled to put my message on there. What I can't do is actually advertise, so to speak. And typically that restriction doesn't come from the federal or the state government. It comes from your local franchise that says that the programming to appear on the public channel has to be non-commercial in nature. So the sale or exchange of a good or service is an advertising or commercial product. That you can't put on. But if I'm from 3M, which is a big employer here in the Twin Cities, just because I'm from 3M and I want to do a program about environmental cleanup in the Twin Cities, as long as I'm not pushing my products or trying to sell anything, there's no reason I should be precluded from appearing on the channel. And I think to the message that everyone's been speaking up here, the more content that you have and the more quality content, the better for the community.
There's kind of two issues there that you brought up. One is the channel itself, and certainly on the public access channel, we see that as a First Amendment forum. However, for those of you who program your government access channel, and there probably aren't many here, but educational access channels, and I'm not an attorney, so I'll defer to Brian. ultimately on this. But what I've told people is the government, on the government access channel specifically, and I think this holds true for educational as well, you are the editor. You decide what goes on that channel, and you can make those, it is not a First Amendment forum. It is more like your city newsletter. And so you get to decide. But having said that, you need to make those decisions very thoughtfully. Because if you decide to put on a program on your government access channel, as one of the local facilities commissions did here, that looks more like a public access program that has come in from someone else, but then you turn around and you deny someone else that access, you put yourself at risk. You've got to have consistent rules about who gets to put programming on your channel. This is more likely to come up in smaller communities where you may only have one channel. But you need, again, think very thoughtfully about what it is and how you program that channel. The second issue that, that we've dealt with, we've got multiple channels, so that's not an issue for us. But for us, in terms of doing the earned production or paid production part of it, we confronted the issue of whether or not we would just do production for nonprofits, and that's where we have come down at this point. And the policy issue, the public policy issue that has been articulated by some of my commissioners is that if we do production for commercial entities, we are competing with people who make their living doing production. And we're subsidized. We get funding from through the franchise, so we are a subsidized entity, and it's an unfair competitive arena at that point. However, as we look at reduced funding over the next few years, I've found that some of my commissioners are changing their minds on that issue, and they may, in fact, say, you know, go for it. So, but those are that's kind of the public policy issue, is that your equipment has been provided by cable subscribers specifically for production on your channel, and again, to the extent that you do production, paid production, or get paid to do production, are you competing with a commercial entity? And I don't know that there's any completely right or wrong answer, but it is a public policy issue you should confront.
We need to quickly wrap up here.
Very, very briefly, I'd suggest people be thinking about mission first instead of money first, and let that drive their decision-making on this question. I think, though, the context that you're speaking about specifically speaks to the idea of developing sponsorship models as well, where you could be partnering with for-profit entities specifically to be supporting broader community messages or broader social campaigns or work that is not necessarily related to selling Scotch tape in the example of 3M. So we probably need to be building the apparatus locally to be able to do that.
Well, yeah, you can have the gold, silver, and bronze model of support for your station, and just, you know, come up with some figures, you know, that they sponsor you over the course of a year or whatever. Two things I wanted to share with you quickly, and I'm sorry, you're going to have to come up and have the, unless you have a statement.
Actually, I do. It's not a question. I don't want to open up a new avenue here, but
Okay.
it's a follow-on comment to what's just been said. And I think that you can do something for general economic development that is not an ad, and I want to give an example, and that is we have in Arlington, Virginia, a show called Food for Thought. It's kind of like the diners, drives, and dive-ins, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And it goes to individual restaurants, does a whole show on them, shows them off, and gets into the community. The community becomes, a business community becomes more aware of this, and this is our government station that's doing this. It's not the
Who
the
decides
public
what
access.
restaurant?
I am not certain. It's probably us who decides what restaurant.
I was just
They may
curious.
apply, we might decide, but there's always that background economic development. If it drives more customers to that restaurant and they pay revenues on their income, there is a benefit there. So it's the context of how you do it. We haven't got a plumber show or an electrician show yet, but maybe we'll get there.
All right. Hey, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike Reardon. On the 4 PEG station tour tomorrow, is Northwest Community Television one of those? Yes?
I'm not sure.
Oh, okay, Cor said yes. The reason I bring that up is because this is real relevant to this topic. They have taken a different approach where they have, in their franchise, like our franchise says no commercial use, and it's, you know, Brian crafted the franchise with us, and so we can't do commercials. But Northwest Community Television took a different approach, and they actually have a channel where they do advertising, local commercial advertising, and they help develop it, and they put it on their channel, and they get paid for it. And I don't know exactly how it works, but Mike Johnson is the executive director for Northwest Community Television out of Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, and seek him out. He was here yesterday. I'm sure he might be here again today. But otherwise, if you're touring there tomorrow, you can get a further information on that.
And Mike, if you could speak to Channel 12 at all about this. But Jeff, the only thing I would say about that is it's not about just money. It's about the local
Right.
the local content, and they plow most of their production into news production, actually. So
A daily news show.
Check out nwct.org, nwct.org. They are an amazing operation.
And the only thing I would add before you elaborate more, Mike, is that they routinely outperform local news broadcast outlets here.
Wow.
Because they serve Brooklyn Park and Plymouth and their 10 communities
Crystal and-
much
yeah.
better than a commercial outlet can. And I just think it's a huge object lesson that you can be meaningful and everyone will know you and be devoted to you
Yeah.
if you do a service that it means something for people.
Jeff, I just want to follow up from the chapters meeting this morning, just as an announcement to everybody, that those going to today's luncheon, get there, get down, and start eating, because once the chairman's speaking, they're done serving. So
Right.
we just wanted to make sure everybody knows, and there will be no Q&A, I guess,
Right.
either. So.
The other thing I would add relative to our conversation today is Todd Barnes from Thornton. There he is right there, Todd. You had a great point this morning about that many of the communities in and around Denver have secured HD channels in their franchise agreements. So I'm showing you who Todd is. I'm saying sick him, get the information, try to get it in with Comcast. Charter's tougher, and, wish you well there. And Brian probably knows that better than anybody. But let's thank Mike Wassenaar, Cor Wilson, and Brian Grogan for today. Thank you. And the next session in here is obtaining PEG HD channels in your next franchise agreement. So, and then upstairs will be considering the public option in broadband deployment. Refreshment break right now in the Mississippi Garden Court East, which is probably the exhibit hall.